sit down and come. See?
Oh, good heavens. I don't want that close up.
That's as far back as it gets.
You're watching Elementary?
No, it
Oh,
isn't.
Sit down. Sit down, let me see.
I better. No, that's too close. It really is. Oh. Yeah, see my. I can't get my.
Let's get you broken.
I know it. Oh well. And I really didn't realize it was that much. It showed that much. I think I'm falling apart. That's what I think.
What's today's
And
date?
this is March 9, 1997.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, do you recall your grandparents?
Yes, except it goes back to childhood days mostly.
Who were they?
My dad's mom and dad were Willis and Ruth Keller. And my dad's parents, I can't remember what his dad's name was, but his mother was named Emma. That's where the Emma Ruth comes from.
Where'd the Ruth come from?
My mother's mother, named after my two grandmothers.
Okay. She was Emma Simmons, and your mom's mom was Ruth Keller. They were French?
On my mom's side.
And the Simmons were English?
And Irish.
English and Irish.
Yeah. And on my mother's side, there was also some Dutch. And in doing what little checking I've done on backgrounds, it seems they left their homeland and went to either Ireland or they made a stop in Scotland before going to Ireland. And both families more or less landed in North Carolina. And then they branched out from that.
What did Granddaddy's father do for a living?
He was a farmer.
Where did he farm in Tennessee?
No, Mississippi.
What did your grandmother was a farmer's wife? And
She was a stay-at-home mom.
Mama's dad, what did he do for her?
Well, he had a farm and he also had a dairy. And that also was in Mississippi. In fact, my dad's family moved to Memphis first. And things got pretty well settled, and then my mom's family started moving up too. And all of my dad's family eventually moved up. But his father died at a pretty young age, actually. And I think it was a heart attack. My mother's father lived to be in his late 70s, but he had a stroke and was a bed patient for years and years. In fact, when he had that stroke, Susie worked, not a slave, but she worked for us and she was paid. And Mother asked her if she'd go and look after her dad. And she said yes. And she looked after him all the time. Hardly any days off for about 10 or 12 years. And she didn't leave until he died. And her name was Susie. And when I say Susie, Catherine and I had a bedroom upstairs, and we had an electrical storm one night. And this is when my mother was recuperating from gallbladder surgery. Well, we had a storm that night, and it was dark as it could be. And of course, Susie was staying at our house, and she was just using an upstairs bedroom. But all of a sudden, I could see this white thing moving around, and it was a little frightening at first, but all of a sudden here was Susie's voice saying, it's okay, it's just me. All we could see was her white gown
Yeah,
laying around.
yeah.
But anyway, she was really a good person.
Mm. And Granddaddy was a streetcar conductor,
Mm-hmm.
and then bus driver.
Yes. And then he worked for the city, and for a long time, he was a guard at Pink Palace.
Oh.
And he worked with the museums in that area. And he liked it. In fact, every so often, he'd get a demand from Social Security to pay him back for so much money because he'd worked too much. He just kept on working.
Yeah.
He didn't want to retire. He's a real people person. This is kind of rambling, but one of my earliest memories, and we still lived in Bahia, and Daddy had gone to Memphis, and it was, I guess, getting close to the 4th of July. He brought back some sparklers and fireworks, and I must have been probably about 3 or 4, but I can still remember how exciting that was.
Mm-hmm.
And then he liked to play cards, but my mother did not. So I got to learn to play cards at a very early age. And we play cards and play cards, and it was fun.
Your recollections of your father. Good times.
Oh heavens, yes. Yeah, he was always good. One thing he had to do, they had split shifts and things when he was working for the Memphis Street Railway. I don't care what time he came home, he wanted all 3 of his children to be at home and in bed. And sometimes he'd wake us up. He had this irritating habit of getting a few nose drops, and he'd just tickle your nose with it, and we'd come up fighting. He loved it, but we hated it.
Yeah.
Oh dear, excuse me. But yeah, he was always good.
He was a character.
Yeah, he really was. Yeah, and a news hound. I know all 3 of us kids, news hounds.
Mm-hmm.
Mother would watch it, but she wasn't all that interested. She liked running home, and she liked cooking, even when Susie was with us.
Mm-hmm.
She'd chase Susie out of the kitchen, she'd do the cooking. But Susie would do the dishes. And I used to hate doing pans that she'd make cornbread in, because she wouldn't rinse them out or anything. You just plunk them in the sink. I said, jeez. But then that's all right. She enjoyed cooking for people. And she was really a good cook, too. Yeah.
Your childhood?
Well, when we were still living in Bahia, I got my first spanking from my father because I hadn't asked my mother if I could go to our next door neighbor's place, whose her husband owned the drugstore in town, had a soda fountain, and they had a son just about my age. And he could take me to the drugstore, and we'd order a milkshake or Sunday or whatever, So I not only went over to their house, I left their house and went to the drugstore, which meant walking a few blocks to get to town. And then back to Kid Hansel was his name. His place, and we started playing with some of his toys and things. And I guess my dad came home, my mother said, she didn't tell me I could do these. Well, all she knew was I was probably over at his house. So he came over, and he pulled a little switch off a tree. And he hit my leg a little bit, and I'd stop, and he'd stop. Well, I never got home. And then I hear tell I sat down in my rocker and rocked and cried for an hour. Oh, goodness. I think I can still remember that anyway. But, the things. And the only other thing that really embarrassed me, because I was probably like in the 5th grade, maybe 6th. But I wanted to go home with a girlfriend from school and spend the night. Well, Mother said no to that. But I could go over and stay a while and then catch a bus and come home. And I decided, well, if I wait till dark, maybe I can stay overnight. So I tried that. No, that didn't work. And what my dad did was get on a bus, come to this person's house. Can you believe it? I can't remember her name now. And to get me. So, and of course that meant we rode a bus back. And he told that bus driver the whole story about what a trick I tried to pull on my mom. And the embarrassment was worse than the switching, I think. But anyway, we got home and it was okay. But I think he enjoyed embarrassing me because of that. And I didn't do it again either. So, of course, I didn't go back to get answers without asking either. But it all worked out.
Are you the firstborn?
Yep, first, yes. 5 years older than Catherine and 8 years older than Buddy. We never even went to the same school.
Yeah.
I was an only child for over 5 years. And then all of us said, oh, but I got to name Catherine.
Oh.
I chose her name.
What's her full name?
They never did give her another one.
Catherine Simmons.
So it's Catherine Simmons Morris. Yeah, so she kept that last before.
Ruth Keller. What do you recall about Uncle Bud?
I really can't recall a lot about his really early years. But Mother thought he was absolutely the neatest thing that ever came along. Kept him spotless. He used to wear those little white outfits in summertime. She'd launder them. And, well, he was the boy that they waited on. But getting up to where he was about early teenage, or maybe 11 or 12, I don't know. He started smoking, and the Scots lived next door. It was Bobby Jones, one of the other with him. And John L. and I had gone out to visit my folks, and for some reason we'd gone out to look at some flowers or the garden or something. And we happened to they heard us coming, we were talking. So we looked around and say hi, Buddy, Bobby. And here was these 2 streams of smoke coming up a few feet away from the 2 of them. And they really worried, Buddy said, afraid we were going to tell on them. But we didn't. So that's one of my earliest memories. Of course, he started playing the guitar when he was pretty young too. Around with it. And he finished high school. He had a job at Sears. And by then, we had moved to Oregon. So he was determined to come to Oregon too. And he just turned 18, I think. Or he turned 18 when he was out. Just after he got here. Because he was going to have to register for the draft in those days. And Mother said, you cannot go unless you get a round-trip ticket. He bought a round-trip ticket, and he stayed there 2 days, I think. He would not sit down by a black person the first day he was here, or the first day he went out to ride a bus anyway. And within 2 days, he had cashed in his ticket for a return trip. Didn't matter who was sitting in a seat. If there was another one available, he used it. And that was the end of him being indiscriminate about things. tell you one thing, I learned a lot on that trip we made across the country. I couldn't believe I missed out on so many things that he and Catherine were telling me about. But I did. But he kept saying, well, you were busy. You had those 2 or 3 boys by then. And I guess that's true. I really concentrated on that. And they were so close, it was hard to go someplace, by myself.
Yeah.
And I always had somebody to leave them with. I just wanted to go to the store or make a quick trip someplace. And if I could have, I would have brought this. She was a very light-skinned person. Her husband worked for the railroad, so there was no point in her moving in place with anybody. But she was so good, she could polish the boys' everyday white shoes, and they looked all good enough. I would take them to church on. And I never could get them to do that when I did it. And anyway, we moved to Oregon. The reason we moved to Oregon was because Paul started having hay fever like Daddy. It was just sheer misery when they had that. And when Paul got so bad with it, Daddy said, no, this child's not going to go through this. It's just not worth it. Where would you like to move?
John Keller.
Your dad.
As opposed to your dad.
Yeah. Who did I say?
You said Daddy.
Oh.
But I wasn't sure if
did.
you were talking about your dad or my
No,
dad.
no, I was talking about your dad. And I toyed around between Vermont or Oregon.
Have you never been to Arizona, Ruth Keller?
I liked snow, remember? And really pictures of the scenery, and things all I had to go by. Except Mr. Scott had been in the Navy, and he had been out here for a year or so. He said, I tell you right now, Oregon is God's country. And that might have influenced my final decision. So anyway, and that all worked out too.
Tell me about now what disease did you have as a child? Crippled your leg, required surgery, a condition, what was that? Led to your ankle?
Well, it started off, I had measles. I started school. I immediately got measles, mumps, chickenpox, all at the same time. That put me in the hospital, and then, well, I'm sure it was blood poisoning, or an infection anyway, all over. Which, I was in the hospital 3.5 months. And I had to have mastoid surgery on both ears, a week apart. And they did the surgery on the one that appeared to be the worst when they did the x-rays or tests. And then they tested him again, and the other ear really had gotten much, much worse. So, 1 week apart, I had those 2 surgeries. And I have a silver plate where it both should be at back of each ear. And Mother didn't think I knew it for years and years. But I knew it from the time I got home, I guess, or when it happened.
How old were you?
First grade, so 6, 7. It took a long time for this to happen and then me to get over it again.
And was it during the hospitalization that your leg got?
Now, the lower thigh was frozen back against the upper part of this leg. And when I went home, the doctors told them they had done all they could do. The rest of it would be up to the good Lord, but they should feed me well. Probably where I got my habit of feeding me well. And I had an old flat iron pulley. It was something on my ankle that permitted it to pull evenly. And 24 hours a day, I was never without that pulling on it. But it worked out really well because my legs are the same length. And they were real concerned that they wouldn't be. So that part of it worked out real well. However, with the infection, the 2 bones on the underneath part of my right heel became fused. No surgery connected with that, just fused. crutches for a long time. And then one night they let me stay up later than usual. Naturally, I got sleepy and I put my crutches down on the porch. And the next morning they were gone. Several years later, we were moving further out into the, well, sort of to the country, on the edge of Memphis. And I saw my crutches come down from the shelf in the closet. And my dad was standing close by. He says, well, he said it hurt me more than it hurt you when I had to do this. I guess that's tough love or something. Anyway, I got so I could, most of my foot would reach the floor. So I learned to walk again. And then I wanted a pair of skates. And they said no. The doctor said no, nobody would give me any skates. So I had been to the drugstore and they had a drawing. And if you sign your name and drop it in a box. Well, I won something that was better than the skates, but another girl won skates. I traded with her. And I took them home. And Mother just couldn't hardly stand it. And of course she said, all right, I know you want those skates, but the only place you can be on them is, we had a spare bedroom, and it had the bed had a foot rest to it. She said you could only go from here to here, and that's it. So I did that for a while, but then I learned to skate pretty well. Then I went outside, and I ended up skating a lot. Then the doctor said that's probably the best thing she could have done. So my ankle might have been more stiff than his now if I hadn't skated. So it kind of pays to listen to your inner voice, I guess. But anyway, I skated. The one thing I wanted to do the most of all was learn to ski. I was afraid to try that because back then I had children to raise. So I just enjoy looking at the snow and seeing other people ski. But that would have been really neat.
How'd you meet Dad?
Well, his sister and I were in school together.
What school was that?
Roselle,
High school?
grammar school. No, I was probably in the 5th grade, and Dorothy was in 6th. And I'm not sure exactly why, but they were having, well, I do know why too, because Daddy's mama didn't work then, and it was Johnny and Dorothy and Mary Elizabeth. But anyway, they were having financial problems, and my dad always had a big heart, so I told him about it. Dorothy and I gathered it, I guess. And the way that house was built, it had a veranda on the front and wrapped around, and it had a door that you could go in that one side, and then the main entrance. So they were renting that, well, they were staying there until I could find something, do something in that area. And Dorothy had a boyfriend at the movies theater. I think this was at Linden Circle. And that was a pretty good walk. But if we walked down there, her boyfriend always got us in. But unless it was a matinee, our parents insisted that John L. go with us. Gee, he could be aggravated. And he was bossy.
So you've known him since the 6th grade or the 5th grade?
Don't you remember him saying, well, I've known you ever since you went barefooted? Except I never went barefooted. But he liked to tell that anyway. And I did not like him at all. he was a nuisance. That's what he was. And then we lost touch because we moved again and they moved. And his oldest brother started selling used cars, or no, new cars, I guess it was. And he decided, well, I bet Mr. Simmons would buy Ruth a car. But that was absolutely a no-no. By then, I was probably in high school then. Anyway, Harry came out, and he really did have a personality of a salesman. And he visited, so of course he went home and told his mother that he had been out and where we lived and all that. So, and we had said, well, bring your mom over sometime to visit. So he did. And then he brought John L. over one time. And that was okay, but I was kind of not too interested. But then John L. started picking me up and taking me to school. Goodbye for my two girlfriends. I shouldn't really tell this part of it. It is not setting a good example for my grandchildren.
We're all old enough.
And great-grandchildren.
We'll scream. Go ahead.
Well,
You skipped school.
yes, I did on Fridays. And I don't know how I got by with it so long, because, boy, we had a vice principal that she was mean, I tell you. But I did. And at least once a month.
How were your grades?
Oh, they were okay. Yeah. I made A's in history and English and things like that. B's. I don't think I ever got really many C's though. I knew I better keep my grades up.
What would you do when you skipped school? And now, what grade are you in at this point?
Probably the 11th. But I'd also skip now and then and go to a movie with Melvin Keller. Well, anyway, I didn't do that as often as I skipped with Daddy though. And what we do, we go back out at my house, so my mother knew, and she'd fix lunch, and then he had to go to work in the afternoon, so he'd have to be back so he could get ready to go to work right after lunch shortly. So I guess I stayed home the rest of the day, probably read a couple of books or something. Michael, you'll have to edit this.
Oh.
I didn't think I was going to tell all of this, my goodness. And anyway, then he went to work for Charles Thomas, moved to New York, then to San Francisco, and then they were on the yacht a lot. And he told me to be sure and write it. And he sent his address by his mother. And I didn't write it. I was real busy then doing other things, I think. And every once in a while he'd tell her to tell me again to write. And she must have told me at least 4 or 5 times. And I don't know, I just didn't. And then one day the telephone rang and I answered it. And this voice says, and just why didn't you write me? And it was John L. Keller. So I don't know what I said now. Probably said, But I started seeing him again. And from then on, he just did everything I asked or even suggested. I thought, gee, he really is a nice guy. Then after we were married, he said, didn't you know those were campaign promises? I said, that figures. But that all worked out all right, too.
You were married in Memphis?
Mm-hmm. February the 3rd, 1938. my mother was recovering from another surgery. So it was not a large wedding, it was just a quiet one. And it was during the war. And I had a lovely blue suit instead of a wedding gown. But just everything was too uncertain those days.
How long before Johnny was born?
Well, we were married on February the 3rd. He was born February the 16th, 1939. Just a little over a year. I don't,
And then, are you okay?
yeah,
You need a break?
well, getting a dry mouth.
Well, take a drink then. Where were you living when John was born?
On Car, just off Cooper Street.
It was you and Dad and Dad's mom
And Mary Elizabeth.
and Mary Elizabeth's dad's youngest sister.
Called her baby sister. She, she never did grow out of that. So I just think that's a bad habit
Yeah.
to get into with. Well, sister would have been all right if they dropped the baby. Or
Just never did.
just never did. It was kind of sad too. Oh, she was so spoiled. It was pathetic.